with each other. In all three faiths, there are conservatives who hold on tightly to the words of their sacred texts, and there are liberals who hold on more loosely and test the ancient words in modern contexts. That practice deepens their faith, makes it more bright, less blind. Sufis are perhaps the most liberal Muslims. They're the mystics and the storytellers, the modern day prophets of Islam. As Ramadan begins, I have this Sufi story of transformation to share. A stream, from its course in the far-off mountains, passing through every kind and description of countryside, at last reached the sands of the desert. Just as it had crossed every other barrier, the stream tried to cross this one, but found that as fast as it ran into the sand, its waters disappeared. It was convinced, however, that its destiny was to cross the desert. And yet there was no way. Now a hidden voice, coming from the desert itself, whispered, "The wind crosses the desert, and so can the stream." The stream objected, saying that the wind could fly, and this was why it could cross the desert. By hurtling in your own accustomed way, you cannot get across, the voice said. You will either disappear or become a marsh. You must allow the wind to carry you to your destination. But how could this happen? By allowing yourself to be absorbed into the wind. This idea was not acceptable to the stream. After all, it had never been absorbed before. It did not want to lose its individuality. And once having lost it, how was one to know that one's identity could ever be regained? The wind performs this function. It takes up water, carries it over the desert, and then lets it fall again. How can I know this to be true? The stream asked. It is so. And if you do not believe it, you cannot become more than a quagmire. But can I not remain the same stream that I am today? You cannot, in either case, remain so. When it heard this, echoes began to arise in the thoughts of the stream. Dimly, it remembered a state in which it, or some part of it, had been held in the arms of the wind. And the stream raised its vapor into the welcoming wind, which gently and easily bore it upwards and along, letting it fall softly as rain once they reached the roof of a mountain many, many miles away, where it then became a river. Please rise now as you are able, as we Here in the United States, the goals of early feminists were hard to achieve, but simple to articulate. Gaining for women not only the right to vote, but access to the halls of power, and eventually equal representation in government. After the 1848 Seneca Falls Convention, women like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton worked tirelessly up to and through 1920, when women finally gained the right to vote. During that period, the Unitarian Association of America and its affiliate, the Western Unitarian Conference, did something that was shocking for its time. In her book, Prophetic Sisterhood, Cynthia Grant Tucker outlines how female ministers, among the first in the nation, were tasked with starting churches on the American frontier. Mary Augusta Ford, Eleanor Elizabeth Gordon, and Caroline Julia Bartlett Crane, to name just a few, made a place for liberal religion in the West. Churches founded on the principle that religion should be oriented toward the present, not the past, and that religious beliefs should be in tune with modern knowledge and experience. These women planted the seeds of a faith rooted in a belief of God, but constantly tested against the experiences of human beings. They believed profoundly that we all have a responsibility to care for each other, to transform the world through reason with equality. The earliest female ministers were ordained by the Universalist Church of America, but couldn't find pulpits there. So Jenkin Lloyd-Jones, the executive director of the Western Unitarian Conference, gave them the chance to become ministers in the American Unitarian Association. He gave them the power and the chance to exercise it, and then stepped aside and let them do their work. All they would have to do is pack up and move to the middle of nowhere to plant new churches in the Wild West, way out in Iowa and Nebraska. They settled in muddy towns with few services, towns populated by speculators and uneducated homesteaders, hick towns that none of the male ministers could be bothered with. These women formed a tight bond with each other and with the communities they served. They built these beautiful, homey sanctuaries and parish houses from local materials, complete with giant fireplaces in these hearth rooms, and they had classrooms to educate the locals. They preached the humanist gospel of Unitarianism on Sundays, but during the week, they taught practical skills like bookkeeping and housekeeping. They were training a generation of well-rounded women who would form the grassroots of the feminist movement in the West. Florence Buck was the first woman to attend a Unitarian seminary, and that was Meadville Seminary, the precursor to modern-day Meadville Lombard. Then it was located in Pennsylvania. She was the first woman to earn a degree in divinity there, and that was where she met Marian Murdoch, her lifelong partner. Together, they served congregations across the United States, including the one my husband served in Cleveland. You're probably wondering, were they a couple? Yes, they were definitely life partners. Now, they never spoke or wrote about the intimate nature of their relationship. They didn't use the language of the time and call themselves Saphists or a Boston marriage. But they were life partners and ministry partners, moving across the country together and sharing pulpits until Florence Buck's death in 1927. The interesting thing about Buck and Murdoch is that they were serving established churches at a time when the rest of the women in ministry were doing all of the establishing. The other women were building from nothing, and they were building, Florence and Marian were building on things that already existed. And they did it well. So well that the towns they were in began to grow. The Unitarian churches were at the center, and those churches grew, and some of them were huge. It didn't take long for the Harvard and Meadville trained ministers to take notice and take over the pulpits. And the men claimed that the women were feminizing ministry, weakening its public authority by peddling a theology that they thought was too soft on theological slackers. They said the women preached a theology lacking in the authority of a male God. A feminized ministry, they said, was a weak ministry that would kill Unitarianism. They began blocking the ordination of women, and by the beginning of the Depression, there were no women left in parish ministry. None. And it took 40 years, more than 40 years, for them to start returning in the 1970s. Men freaked out in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. But by the 1970s, they had the same resistance to women in the pulpit as other men had to women in the workplace. They complained that women were a distraction to the men. They grumbled that women were distracted by the responsibilities of raising families. If a woman minister got pregnant, the men would gloat. All the while, the guys referred to their female peers as dolls, called them baby, commented on their bodies, just like the dudes in the factories. But women kept answering the call to ministry. In 1978, 6% of UU clergy were women. In 1988, 25%. And by the turn of the millennium, more than half of our clergy were women. That is a massive transformation in about 35 years. In the last 10 years or so, I've been to several big events like ordinations, installations, clergy retreats, that kind of thing, in which 0 men were in leadership. Last Sunday, I was at the installation of a colleague at our West Roxbury congregation, the Theodore Parker Church, which he served for 5 years in the early days of Unitarianism. Reverend Heather Concannon, the newly settled minister, I'd like to point out, is pregnant. And nobody freaked out. There were 38 ministers pregnant. Wow. Can you imagine? 38 pregnant ministers. There were 38 ministers present last Sunday, and about a dozen were actually part of the ceremony. But we all gathered outside for an invocation before the processional. And I looked around the circle and I did what I do. I counted. There were 6 cis men, 2 trans women, and 3 people that I know to identify as non-binary. That means 27 of the 38 people present were cisgender women. Of the dozen ministers with roles in the service, there was 1 cis man, 1 trans man, and 1 non-binary person assigned female at birth, and 9 women. I've been to similar services where the only ministers involved identified as women. And the funny part was, in all those circumstances, the women involved didn't even notice that there were no men involved. 10 years ago, when this kind of thing would happen, they didn't even notice it. That's how much things have changed. From what I can tell, the vast majority of cisgender men who remain in ministry in our faith define themselves as committed feminists. They try to be kind of the Ted Lassos of ministry. They want to teach other men, ministers and lay people, to not be sexist pigs and to decenter their own needs and experiences. They want to hold each other accountable, even as they take back seats in denominational leadership. The thing is, just like the women, all the men have read Sharon Welch. Sharon Welch isn't an ordained minister, but she has been on the faculty at Harvard Divinity School and the University of Missouri. She's been on the faculty at Meadville Lombard for about 15 years now. She wrote a book called A Feminist Ethic of Risk, which for 2 decades has been required reading for UU ministers in training. It's foundational to understanding the nature of the work for the majority of ministers now, ministers of all genders. The ethic of risk that Sharon Welch outlines is about turning upside down old theological assumptions. Assumptions like God is a man, and that men, because of their gender, are more godlike than women, so that, like God, men are always right and have a responsibility to exert control. Because, of course, control is the only way to maintain order and safety, which are, of course, the most important things. So the ethic of risk, of course, takes all those assumptions and just throws them out the window. Now, of course, this theology that I just outlined isn't exactly a stretch for any UU. I mean, I don't think any of us believe in this patriarchal father anthropomorphic God. But back in 2000, when women were just becoming the majority of clergy in our faith, the part that was hard for the old guard to get was that what they saw as maintaining order and safety in our association was really just them holding on to the power that they had held for generations. Now, this is not surprising to anyone, right? I know I'm preaching to the choir about all this stuff. But here's the really interesting part about the ethic of risk. It acknowledges that unchecked power will rear its ugly head again and again, forever and ever. That is just the nature of humanity. Whoever holds the power, even women. Because the ethic of risk acknowledges that we are all flawed and that we all bear some responsibility and some power in the conflicts that we engage in. And that we have to study strategies for resolving conflicts as much as we study strategies for fighting wars, even little wars within our congregations and our denomination. The ethic of risk acknowledges that change, even if it's only temporary, is possible. And so the ethic of risk infuses every aspect of community ministry, especially for anyone ordained since 2000. If we go back to the metaphor of the Sufi tale that I shared at the beginning of the service, the ethic of risk is about the kind of transformation that requires us to break ourselves down and trust that the process is the only way to reach our goals of equity. Taking risks as individuals, congregations, and as an association will create the kind of world that we want to live in. And we have to do it again and again and again, especially as power shifts. So transformation requires taking risks. And that kind of transformation can be terrifying when you are at the beginning of it, unable to see what comes at the other end of that arc that you are trying to bend as you're moving it along. Right now, as congregational life changes for every faith community in America, there's greater resistance to change, just like there is out in the public square, legislatures and courtrooms all across the United States. I think about the men of the 19th century and their resistance, and right now it's the same scenario all over again. The same fears of losing power or presence on center stage, the same resistance to inevitable change. All those men who were so worried about the feminization of ministry back in the 19th century, got to admit, they kind of had a good reason to be afraid, because the UUA has become exactly what they feared, feminized by the ethic of risk. All of these people who are not cishet men have brought to the table an appreciation for the benefits of risk. And most of the cishet men have come along for the ride to be allies, showing up and doing the hard work, often doing what Jenkins Lloyd Jones did and just give the power and step back and watch, support. Embracing risk has transformed us. That's why transformation is one of the words in the proposal for our new Article 2. You know, the original proposal, created more than a year ago, used instead the word evolution. When I first saw it, I thought it kind of sounded like it was about the triumph of science and reason over religious mythology. Now, personally, I think science and mythology can coexist. They just ask and answer very different kinds of questions. So I thought the word evolution was kind of weird. But the thing is, that was only part of what the authors of the proposal meant by evolution. They also meant that as an association of congregations, we've evolved over time, and we will continue to evolve. But the thing about evolution is that it kind of just happens on its own. There's an inevitability to evolution. One thing leads to the other. But transformation is different. Transformation requires intentionality. Transformation is wanting to change. Evolution is assuming that the arc will bend toward justice on its own over time. Transformation is knowing that if we want that arc to bend, we have to bend it ourselves. May we continue to be transformed as we move into this new phase of our bylaws and our expression of our values. May we continue to allow ourselves to be evaporated in the scorching heat of changing times, only to reemerge exactly where we want to be. Let's rise now in body or in spirit and sing together number 10.